Hello, everybody.
Hi. Hello.
Welcome.
It's another day, another CLCI Live. Before we begin, friendly reminder that to subscribe, hit that subscribe button, and we absolutely want to hear from you. We would love to hear from you. Please. Let us know what's going on. Let us know what you're thinking. And join in the conversation. We do this live so that can happen. And we are going to now talk about what we're talking about.
What are we talking about?
We have switched gears from Emotions 101, and for this month, we are talking about controversial coaching 101. The controversies, the debates, the weird stuff that goes on in coaching.
This should be fun.
Yeah, this is hopefully will be an interesting month. Specifically, we are talking about controversial coaching 101, triggered, crazy, OCD, manic, when buzzwords do harm.
So
Do they do harm? Do these words do harm to people?
Yes, they don't like them a lot of the time.
Can words hurt people?
Yes.
I thought
Yes.
sticks and stones could.
We went through this on the emotions.
we did, yeah.
I know. I'd like to reevaluate that.
Of course you do.
Okay, so they can do harm. Where should we start? How do we kick off this topic? Because we're including a mixed bag of buzzwords. What do they all have in common, though?
Well, they're all traditionally mental health words that we've mainstreamed, and everyone uses them, and everyone thinks they understand them, and they're thrown around like candy.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. And that can cause some harm and do some things for everybody. So before we go into like what the harm is, can you guys think of like what are some buzzwords? What are some things that are very commonly thrown around
Ooh, I've
in
got
day-to-day
full
vernacular?
show.
Yeah.
Triggered, crazy, OCD, and manic.
No.
You are not helpful at all at the moment.
Okay, you want more than that then.
Oh my
Gaslighting.
gosh.
That's a new one. How about that?
What?
Gaslighting? Yeah.
Gaslighting.
That's a big one, yeah.
ADHD. Everyone has ADHD, right? We all use it all the time.
Yeah, and everybody
Yeah.
apparently has it. And
Yeah.
that's not very fair to somebody who actually has it diagnosed.
Right.
That's not
Exactly.
very cute, right? But
I've had a few clients share with me a boundary like the word crazy and say, I don't like that word, as it had come up just arbitrarily, not labeling anything. Isn't that crazy? Just saying that word was not comfortable for them. Not that we were labeling anybody or any thing, just as a filler word, I guess you would say.
Like when somebody's like telling you a story and you're just like, yeah, that's crazy.
Yeah.
Like as a filler word.
And they were triggered by that.
it's a big one.
Yeah.
Triggered is probably the number one. Like,
Yeah.
I don't know. I think a close second is trauma.
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
Okay, that's a good one.
Like a close second, like the word of the people use that word trauma a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And then we start to dig in. I actually have a huge list of words.
Oh, great.
But I'm not sure that we want to like go down the list. And you mentioned
What are the top
gaslighting.
10?
Well, they're in alphabetical order. So
Can you sort them into top 10 order? What about narcissist?
Yep.
one.
For sure.
Mhm.
Sociopath.
Sociopath, which is not even really a mental health diagnosis anymore. It's just you call people a sociopath because you don't like them.
All the time, that's what I call it. Anybody I don't like is automatically a sociopath. Like 100%.
Oh, did we say gaslighting? I don't think.
Yeah, that was the
Yeah,
first
we
one.
did.
Okay, just kidding.
Mm-hmm.
Addicted. That's one that's like so common in people's lexicon that like
Mm-hmm.
you don't even think of that it's like normally a mental health associated word. I'm just addicted to pizza. I'm
Mm-hmm.
addicted to cigarettes.
Mhm.
I'm addicted to alcohol. We'll just throw it around.
I'm
all
addicted
over
to
the place.
Tony Robbins. Sorry, Anthony. I didn't mean to talk about your personal life.
No. Depressed. I'm feeling
Depressed.
depressed instead of
That's a
sad.
big one.
Anxiety.
Yeah.
I mean,
I have
everyone
anxiety.
all the time.
There's one I hadn't thought of, which was brainwash. Like,
Hmm.
not I don't think used as much, but apparently it is something that can like be misused.
I don't know if that's like is that really a mental health related like term though?
This is technically listed on my psychological and psychiatric terms, and it is an actual I can't think of the word, but scientific article that I'm looking at. And just to increase my argument here, the term originated in the Korean War, but was used from time to time in academic literature. And then it got bigger and bigger as time passed, essentially. But yeah, technically, I guess it's not technically, but it's
I'm thinking of terms that maybe originated in the psychiatric or psychological, like academic domain, and then became common usage. It seems like that might have started as common usage and then went into the academic. Yeah,
I could see that. Yeah. Okay.
But there's a lot of buzzwords, and some of those
think,
buzzwords trickle into coaching.
Yeah, like you said, obsessive compulsive disorder, like
OCD,
being schizo, any
multiple personality.
Yeah, yes, multiple personality, bipolar. Anytime we're using any kind of psychiatric term to define something that is, I think, it's stepping into some dangerous territory.
Yeah, we don't do it.
Yeah.
As a coach,
yes. Our clients might be using them, but that's also may not be true as a coach. I mean, I would
kind of use them as like in our lives before, though. We've talked about like being triggered, or the coach being triggered, or the client being triggered,
and trauma, and
them being crazy and having OCD and manic. Okay, maybe not those last three buzzwords, but
but that's because that's relevant. We have to. I mean, like we have to talk about triggers in coaching. What was the other one you said?
Do we have to talk about triggers in coaching?
Yeah, for sure.
When they come up, right?
Hold on. Let me reframe that question. What do you mean by we have to talk about it as coaches
in our coach training?
In our coach training, not
yeah.
In our coaching to the person we're coaching.
I mean, not unless it's to like explore that with the client. No, I don't think we are intentionally trying to talk about, hey, that looked like that triggered you. Tell me more about that. We don't do stuff like that.
Yeah, just making that clear for the viewers. So we do touch on these sort of topics when we are trained to be coaches, or we're aware of them.
That was nice.
So yeah, and it's funny because one of the Time articles I was reading mentions sort of like this is a red flag in like your mental health advertisements, like things that are being advertised to you, and how red flags. Big red flags are people using phrases like inner child work and like jargon heavy posts of things like trauma, all of these. And the second part of that is also people who are essentially promoting self-diagnosis or promoting like self-diagnosis labels, like people who are treating, narcissists, ADHD, things like that, as coaches, and that being a very careful place to tread in, and
Well,
using
hold on.
jargon around those things. Yeah.
Well, we have ADHD coaches.
Yes,
That's a thing.
we do. I agree. So, but it's like there's a careful. The big difference is this self-diagnosis piece. I think having somebody come to you for
I see.
things that they're doing, but it's another thing for somebody to come to you not having a diagnosis, and then the coach to either suggest as much, or for that person who isn't diagnosed to be going and seeking ADHD coaching when they aren't even diagnosed with ADHD. There's like a weird murky space that happens there. You know what I mean? I think it's one thing if I am me and I know I have ADHD and I know what the symptoms are and what I have to deal with. I'm being treated for it on a professional or psychiatric level, or I've chosen not to, but I've done that work, and then I can go get a coach. Right? Then somebody who hasn't done any of that work thinks they might have to have it, and are going to their solutions for coaches. And I think that's where that space gets really gray.
How do you even validate that as a coach? Like if I was an ADHD coach and I work with people who have ADHD, how do I realistically and ethically, validate who does and who does not have an actual ADHD diagnosis? So it seems like that's a really...
I think that you're going to have a big disclaimer in there somewhere.
As a coach, you cannot.
Yeah, which is my opinion would be, I'm not touching that subject or that niche with a 10-foot pole. I don't know how I would. I mean, I probably could sit down for 30 minutes and try to figure it out, but my gut reaction is I'm just not going to coach them.
Most everybody is coachable. It doesn't mean that we're coaching for the diagnosis. What we're coaching is the individual who wants to make. I'm going to label it as an improvement. It might be something to learn. It might be something to grow from. It might be something. So just say that growth space. They might want to have growth space and accountability in a behavior they want to further develop. That I can coach. But specifically on the medical side of it, that's not for me to prescribe. Really is the difference, right? You're working with someone's behaviors on one side where they want to make changes and adapt, find their adaptability to certain things, whereas I'm not going to tell my client what they should and shouldn't be doing as a prescription.
Yes. That's a big prescribing piece. It's very important there. And so those are the areas we've got to move through cautiously, which I know is sort of straightforward. I mean, I think it's a little more straightforward when we say like ADHD and things like that. But when we get into terms like triggered, let's start there. What happens? It's a little murkier, right? As Jen mentioned.
Well, you've got to get the client's meaning, right? You can't assume that you know what they mean when they say triggered. So that's the first step, is making sure you understand what they're talking about.
Well, before I continue this conversation, to help me sort of like organize my thoughts, like words have different meaning in different contexts. So I don't want to say that just the word triggered is a buzzword that's harmful. It's in what context is it being used? Is it the client who is saying that they are being triggered and they're using it as a buzzword, or are they using it in a context where it's like, oh, they went to a psychologist and this is a trigger that they've identified that causes, let's say PTSD, versus a coach saying trigger, or maybe identifying triggers, or using the word trigger in their marketing. because every single context changes maybe what is and isn't acceptable with that word or any word. So, but you mentioned, Jen, I think it was the client who was saying triggered, and the coach asking into it and not assuming,
Right.
as to what context that client is using it.
So there was an interesting article too that was shared in all of this about this word triggered and how it's got more power than it probably should, because it has become such a big thing in our culture using that word trigger that as soon as somebody is triggered, it's almost like there is a loss of like everybody is supposed to step away and relinquish, like and shut down whatever is going on in an effort to untrigger somebody, essentially. But the truth of the matter is that's a big difference between like using phrases like I felt triggered, or being able to sort through the emotions and getting to the emotions is actually probably a more productive way of expressing yourself, because it's not shutting down other parties, where this word trigger has become a sort of way to just sort of stop communication in a lot of ways, or shut down other people's communication. And it can be something that is a little murky, because it doesn't, taking aside that its original meaning when somebody was triggered, it was related to PTSD, and it's this series of physical reactions that happen that are very intense and very disorienting, and there's a lot of big things happening physiologically, but it's become so socially accepted that anytime people feel a negative emotion or an emotion they don't want to feel, they associate it with triggering and being triggered. And the problem with that is it takes this big thing that being triggered is for somebody with PTSD, where it is huge, this huge event, and it makes it tiny, makes it all of these other little things tiny, and it sort of takes away the real expression of that word for its original meaning. But that's where it gets kind of dangerous or scary, or not even gray, I guess would be the word, is like, well, you were triggered, but what are you feeling when you were triggered? Because that can be so many things now. And you really have to dig into that. And are you still taking ownership of your emotions when you're expressing being triggered? Or is our client, or are my question,
So your question is, when someone is being triggered, are they taking ownership of their emotions?
Well, I think it's going to vary person to person, but things to consider
Right.
when we are using that word, or when our clients are using that word. And I think as coaches, I would caution introducing a word like that without our clients having introduced it prior to us.
Absolutely.
Definitely.
Yeah.
But the even getting them to define what the trigger, not what the trigger is, but defining what trigger is to them. Right. That's going to be an important conversation piece.
Or if that's even even
if they bring it up. Yeah.
If they bring it up, and if that's a conversation they want to go down, because if it is legit, I'm making a distinction between legitimate uses of the word trigger and illegitimate uses of the word trigger, like it's just, some jargon I'm using to say that I'm upset. If it is one of those legitimate uses of the word, the coach probably needs to be a bit more careful and say, like, do you want to continue the conversation the way it's been going? I don't know if a coach by themselves is qualified to talk about the trigger if it has to deal with one of those legitimate cases.
Agreed. This is a very, very big book that says we can't work in this as a coach.
You're stepping on the toes of psychology. So probably the first step would be to ask, what do you mean by trigger?
Yeah.
Can you help me clarify what you mean by trigger? And then you can sort of get the feel of, okay, they're just using it as like jargon. And then maybe as a coach, you could meet them, on that level, use their language. Um, I don't know if it's your job to correct necessarily your client if they're using, you know, language like that.
Well,
Maybe not correct, but create distinction. I think it is our job, because if someone's using trigger over and over and we don't make the distinction between, sometimes they're just annoyed
Mhm.
and then sometimes they're legitimately feeling like intense anger. That's all blurred together. We don't have anything to like actually, utilize if it's all a blur. We've got to kind of pull it apart and see the pieces of it a little more clearly, because someone being annoyed, it may not be a problem, but the intense anger, that may be the problem. So that may be the thing that goes into therapy with them, but the annoyance can stay in the coaching, something like that. I'm thinking,
Yeah.
it's like the distinction would be important.
I want to now hit on the opposite of the spectrum, where the coach preemptively introduces the word trigger in their language with like trigger warnings. You see, I've seen discussion on books before, like where every book now should have trigger warnings, or you should have trigger warnings, maybe in front of before content that you post that's like maybe controversial. Maybe we should have had a trigger warning for this live. But I think a long time ago, like maybe when we did triggers as a coach or a CLCI live topic, we talked about the possibility of maybe including like a form or somewhere where a client can, let you know prior to coaching what their triggers are, so
Right.
that you can avoid those conversations or those topics. I wonder if, in light of this conversation, what do we think about that still?
I would honestly, I don't think I would ever include a form like that. I mean, outside of having a conversation, okay, I say that, but I've had conversations with clients where, because we're getting into emotional spaces, especially as you get to PCC coaching, and that we are getting into emotional places. And there are times where I have had clients tell me, I'm not ready to go there. It feels like too much. That feels like too much, and I'm not ready to go there. But that came from exploration. And I don't think, I'm not sure that I would ever like give a client the out, unless they just told me right out the bat, but I'm not going to set them up for it saying, I'm not going to go here, like prior to, right? Like at least for me as a coach, I'm not going to like invite them to do that. They can do that on their own, but I'm not going to I would like it to be a space where we can explore anywhere eventually. Right. And I think if I say, what are your triggers, I'm going to avoid that. That's going to take away some real organic conversation in what we're doing. And it's one thing for them to say it as we're exploring, and for us to honor that, or maybe, or discuss into that. And it's another thing for them to like give me a list of topics I have to avoid, which I'm just not going to do. That's just not going to fly for me. And if there's still so much of a space like that, I would say they need to be in therapy. Like they need to be seeking some kind of other help so that they can get to a space where you don't have to tiptoe with them in a coaching space. Like for me, if you're in a space where they're triggering that easy, that's a big sign that they need some kind of psychological help or a therapy or something they need to work through that is outside the bounds of what I can do as a coach. So right off the bat, if that's what I'm getting, I'm saying you need to be somewhere else. Like that's me and my 2 cents. But there's definitely times I will respect a client when they say, I don't want to go there. That's too much right now. And but they're not using words like trigger, but I mean, kind of, especially in PCC, the whole point of what we're doing is to elicit emotion and feelings out of our clients. And they're not, it's usually the ones that are harder feelings, or these things that we have to explore that come forward, and that's part of this coaching process. So you will feel emotion in coaching, like I would say, especially if you're doing PCC level coaching or higher. The other thing to consider too in this is brain just died on me. Just kidding. Nothing to consider. It died.
Awesome. We're
Just
going
to-
live then.
Build on what you're saying. When we're talking about being capable of diving into emotion, it's an exploration of what they mean, or the definition, and so that they're providing the information for themselves, not really for us, right? That information is not to inform me or me be informed. It's helping that client figure out what is important to them and how they want to process it, and where today that's going to be important for their growth and development in the way that they want to move through this next phase that they're working on. It is not for us, the coach, however, to be informed. That's kind of a different space. And when we're asking into those questions, into the client's questions, and probing into what they've shared, it is strictly for the client.
Can we go back to the trigger warning potentially on like marketing and content?
Oh my God. I've seen so many coaches use that as like.
So I think that's a really interesting topic. Me personally, I don't think there's a right or wrong. Shocking. I think it's whatever aligns with you and who you are as a coach. So like for me, if I was putting trigger warnings on my content, I would assume that I would be attracting clients who like trigger warnings, who want trigger warnings. I'm not interested in attracting that type of client. I would actually like to attract a client that is willing, to see my content and either make a decision not for me, right? Maybe too much, or maybe, or they're all in with me. So, I mean, again, no right or wrong answer, but I think, again, who are you as a coach? Me personally, like I don't, very rarely, there might be sometimes that it's appropriate. I can think of a few, but it's not going to be my general state of being is to give people trigger warnings. So why would I do that to try to attract people who like trigger warnings? It doesn't make any sense.
I think, go on.
The other side of it too, though, is I've seen coaches use trigger warnings as like edgy ways to attract clients. Like, you will be triggered, or trigger warning. I'm gonna,
it's kind of like the forbidden
boundary.
fruit.
Like, you're not gonna feel comfortable. And like I've seen that, like, just to sort of like put that out there. Like, I'm edgy. I'm willing to push.
This coaching's not for triggered liberal snowflakes.
Yes, but that's truly, I've seen that exists out there. So people, have used them in every which way.
I mean, I just looked at the blog we did, and it was in 2021, and the title of the blog is "Trigger Warning!" Exclamation point! How triggers come up in life coaching. So it's like you have to also think of it as a keyword in marketing, plus it, having its psychological meaning as well.
Interesting.
Which makes us kind of a good controversial topic, because the controversy is people think, yes, you should include trigger warnings in the content you produce. And on the other side, the controversy is no, you shouldn't have to do that. Which I think, Jen, from your description, you're more on the no, you don't have to do that side of the argument. Can anybody here, other than me just playing devil's advocate, argue that yes, you should do that?
Well, I've used them in. I'm gonna sound all like foofy girl. Okay, so I not foofy, but in my recovery, I wrote poetry, and I wrote poetry, or and if not poetry, I wrote some, like, I don't know what you would call it, like long form poetry too, I guess, but
prose poetry.
Prose, there we go, on my PTSD, my actual true triggered moments, those times when I was really triggered, and I did a metaphor of essentially it felt like a rope was tied around my heart, essentially, and like it was squeezing it was strangling it, and then when it would go away, and it was like this whole thing. And so I shared it on some PTSD and survivor groups, and every single one of those groups absolutely required I apply a trigger warning, right?
Right,
And
right.
with reason. Trigger
Yeah.
warning, strangulation, trigger warning,
Yeah.
anxiety, like that. And
Yeah.
it wasn't like nobody was being physically strangled in my poems. It was a metaphor, but still, when you're dealing with people who are in a survivor group and a safe space, that's the kind of, it's just like etiquette, like, and it's space for etiquette, and that is a known etiquette for that group. And so 100% I think that is more than reasonable, because that place is safe for those reasons, for those people. And so I think, yes, absolutely.
That's another buzzword, safe space, right there.
Yeah. I agree. Yes, true. It is. And also
the coaching container is a safe space.
So like that's the funny
Is
thing about
it?
all of these words is they can all, when misused, they can all be used for manipulation. And like
Absolutely.
that's why it gets scary and dangerous with them. And that's why we have to use them respectfully and responsibly if we can. I mean, I'm not saying like we can't go out there and throw these words out there. I just be aware. It's having the awareness of the fact that these things can be used in, words can be used in many different ways. Let's switch out of triggers and talk a little bit about the word trauma.
So the person's roommate asking them to do the dishes, that doesn't qualify as trauma?
I mean, I'm traumatized every time I'm asked to do the dishes.
I mean,
I don't know.
you had a dish, if you had a dish thrown at your head or something, and you have some sort
That's
of trauma,
physical trauma, Jen. We're talking about emotional trauma.
you have both physical and emotional trauma from trauma.
Yes, exactly.
They're not separate. Yeah. So, okay, so I'm taking a trauma class.
Yes, I figured Jen would want to hop in on this.
One of the things that we had to do was we had to come up with like our own interpretation of how we would describe it to our client. And so for me, it's like there's in learning, there's a lot of different types of trauma, a lot that I was like, oh, wow, I have that. And I didn't even realize I had that. I chalk it up to like, oh, that's just normal. That stuff happens when you're a kid. No. That was actually like developmental trauma that happened. So I've learned there's a lot, and the reality, it looks like, is that we all have it one way or another. Now, the severity of it is where the difference is. And so like the way I described it is almost like it's an imprint or a branding, like the way you would brand a cow, right? It's not only creating something physical, but it's creating an emotional memory. So like the cow, it heals, right? The branding heals, but if it smells the hot iron, I don't know. Of course I had to look into branding, which was not fun for me by any means. And it was like, oh, that can trigger the memory of the pain of that moment, and the cow can like freak out. And I was like, oh my God, that's what we do as humans. We have that moment where something creates that memory, and then we're experiencing it in that moment, both emotionally and potentially physically. There's a physical sensation happening too. So anyway, so the way I would describe it is that it's something that has happened to you that you've experienced as traumatic. It doesn't have to be a big trauma that society would say, yes, that's a trauma. If you experienced it as traumatic and it created an imprint on you emotionally and physically, then yeah, that's trauma. And most likely we all have it.
Yes. And it's not for us to say what is traumatic and what isn't traumatic for somebody else. Yeah.
Exactly. Like I have a very specific memory of being yelled at when I was a kid by a grown man, and he yelled at me. I was pitching in softball, and he yelled at me to throw harder because I was a big girl. And it was like the most traumatic moment, because I'm this little 10-year-old girl and this grown man is yelling at me, and I haven't like fully understood how much that traumatized me until recently. until I was like, wow, I have carried the feeling of being that 10-year-old girl with me my whole life. My whole life. She's stayed with me. That moment. I can go back to it like that, you know. So again, is that trauma? To some people, no. To some people, that's a nice little fairy tale. Oh, boo-hoo. Some man yelled at you. Big deal. But to me, at 10 years old, that was extremely traumatic. So yes, you can't judge someone's trauma. If they experienced something and it felt traumatic and it created an imprint on them, then it's trauma.
And so when we come into using this word and how we use this word, how do we think it can be misused?
Well,
I mean, it's just used as a sliding scale of describing varying degrees of emotional distress. So Jen's story versus my tongue-in-cheek story about being asked to do the dishes, using that as both the same way of saying, like, I'm unhappy with, you know, what was done or said or what happened, would be the buzzword form of it. It's like saying, and using an example, it's like saying you love your spouse versus you love burritos, or you love
I do love
going to the
burritos.
park.
I do.
But you don't love them in the same way, even though you're using the same word to describe it.
Oh, gotcha. Now I see what
I love lamp.
Yeah.
I love lamp.
So you're using, to go back to trauma, people are using trauma to describe different things, but there's a connection there in that there's some form of distress. There's some form of lasting or short-term lasting or long-term lasting unpleasant feelings that go with that trauma.
I think it's.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Jen.
You go.
Okay, I was going to say I think it's inappropriately used when you tell someone you're dealing with trauma right now, based on a reaction that they give you. Telling someone what their trauma is I think a dangerous space to go, because like Jen just said, we find our own trauma. So
yeah.
What if you're a coach and someone is describing a situation that seems traumatic to you, but maybe they haven't. They're not using the word trauma to describe this, but in all ways they, like, Jen, let's say you told me this story in a coaching session about you as a child, as a 10-year-old, and you haven't used the word trauma before, but you're telling it the same way. You have the same feelings related to that. And my coaching head, I'm like, this is trauma that she's probably talking about. Do I ask into this, or do I tread lightly and maybe refer out if I'm not even, comfortable going into that space?
Well, we don't know enough at this moment.
Yeah. And also, you said if I'm not comfortable. Well, if the coach is not comfortable, the coach can't go. The coach can't go somewhere where they're going to be uncomfortable. Yeah. So we wouldn't ask into that unless you know how to hold space for Pandora's box being opened, essentially. Yeah. And so, that's why ACC is like coach the problem versus PCC is coach the person. You have a little different skill set as far as
and that's what's interesting too about it. It's something to keep in mind too, is we don't have enough information yet, right? Like Jen might just be sharing a story, but I have shared stories of events that were once traumatic to me, right? Once trauma that I was very much affecting my life now, and this is to Sue's point. In that moment, and now I have since worked my way through them. One of them was being almost killed, right? That happened, and I can now share it, and I share it lightly. And I have to remember though that when I share that to people lightly, I'd have to put a big disclaimer around it. Like I'm always like, as I share this, know that it doesn't affect me anymore. I actually look at it as something that I'm very glad that I went through in my life. I wouldn't wish it on anybody. It's not the choice I would have chosen, but I have learned from it. I'm a better person because of it. And I made peace. Like there is peace there. And so like, I always have to give that disclaimer because for other people, I even think for Anthony, when I first told him, he was like, that's big, that's scary, that's true. And I was like, no, I'm okay. Like, it's not, I'm okay. Like, that's
Yeah, I made you feel real bad about it.
I'm okay. So I think that, like, that's why you have to ask more into that before assuming that, it is one thing or another, or your client feels one way or another about it, because it could be two very different things. I have, trauma from my childhood that is much probably smaller on the superficial scale of when you look at it from a third party perspective, somebody almost murdering you versus it being having cotton balls thrown at me because I was getting boobs growing as a kid, and feeling like in that moment very kind of made fun of and bullied, and but that I was probably, it sits with me now because I've never really explored it. I've never really like picked it apart, and will come up in weird ways now more than the other thing I've experienced, because I spent a lot of time working my way through that and coming to the other side of it. Where those little things from when I was younger, I haven't sat down and taken the time to, because it wasn't so obvious. It's not so obvious. So it's interesting, and I think that piece of really getting to know how it is affecting your client today and moving forward with whatever it is you're working on is what becomes important.
Yeah. Anthony, you asked, like, if you were coaching me and I brought that story forward, would you ask into it or not? I mean, truthfully, if a client does something like that in a session with me, I do ask, because I'm not afraid. I am comfortable. I trust myself to hold the space no matter where it goes. It's taken a while to get there. Let me just say that. I didn't get certified and then feel confident in that area. It's been 2 years. But yes, I would ask, how is that showing up for you today? Similar, Sue, to what you're saying, does that still affect you today? I would even go as far as, when I hear someone talking about this younger version of them, ask if there's a message. Like, is there a message, either for that little girl or that little girl wants to give to you? And I know that kind of sounds inner child woo, right? But it's still a coaching question. And if the client's bringing that moment into the space, I'm going to honor that. I'm not going to shy away from that.
Well, what I mean when I was asking that, I was like, what if a person is using all of the descriptors of trauma, emotional trauma, it is still affecting them today?
Definitely refer out.
Then refer out.
Yeah, I'm wondering, how does a coach say, is it appropriate in that moment to say, this kind of sounds like trauma to me? Maybe we refer out for this, or we steer the conversation.
So, I don't know that I would label it. I would.
And for clarity's sake, trauma is not like a diagnosis. Yeah. Like, it's not like, there's post-traumatic stress disorder is a diagnosis, but you're not going to walk into a place, doctor's office, they're going to go, you have trauma, and I'm going to prescribe you X, Y, and Z for it. Like, that's not how the world works, because as Jen said, we all have trauma. So it's about how we're processing the trauma.
Yeah. You could say, sorry, Brooke, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Go ahead. No, you're fine. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You could say, what type of support do you think you need on that? Because it might be outside my scope of practice, and I want to check in and see what you think about that. Do you think you need more support on that aside from the coaching? That's, now you put them in the driver's seat of like, hey, what do you think about what you just brought into the space with us? So,
you can be more direct in that specific time as well. What you're discussing, how it's impacting you today. That's outside of my practice, outside of my scope of practice. In the therapy world, this is really where they work in their, so it's like kind of an upsell for therapy in that space. for them to really develop and dive in that moment to see how it's really impacting them continually from their history, even today. So there's a fine line between how is that impacting you today, which is typically a good question for a coach, but there's also then that fine line where it's going down a path that really needs to have a trained professional really doing that deeper dive in that space. That doesn't mean that we don't do deep dives. It's just that we don't do deep dives in that space.
But we do a little bit, but not really. But like, because I mean, the gray area there is like there are. I can't think of a single session where my client hasn't at some point recounted something from the past.
Right.
And that's okay. Like that's not an automatic symptom that like thing. It's how are they applying it forward? So
Right.
yeah, I think there's a big distinction there. Like it's okay. Your clients are going to tell you about how they. I mean, that's part of how did you feel about that? What was that like?
Yeah.
But like how, and then we bring it into the present. We bring it forward. And if they just can't bring it forward, that's where that
Right. If you ask them, like, what's the connection between what you just shared and what we've been working on, or where we're at in our, present today, and they can't connect the dots there, then that to me would indicate, they need more support to work in the past before they can at least.
Or they might not know yet. I mean, there's a possibility that this just dawned on them that they go, oh,
Right.
I don't know what that connection is yet. And then further down, I realize what that connection is. Here's that piece that was missing. And here's, where that next step is. Right. So there is a fine line, and yet still coachable, like Brooke was mentioning, but also have in your back pocket someone you can refer them to.
Okay. Before we just turn this into a win to refer live, Anthony, what were you going to ask?
I was just going to go into like specific buzzwords like related to actual diagnoses, like what we have in our title, OCD or manic or depressed or
and
hysteric.
I think the whole point of all of those, yes, like manic, not just every person with high energy isn't experiencing mania, not what it means necessarily, but I would just like, as a coach, because there are moments where we introduce observation, right? Where we will say, and we are going to, when we introduce an observation, it's an observation from our perspective, ideally in words our client will understand or relate to, but they may not. And if they don't, that can also tell us something, right? But when we're making those observations, we can make an observation that might say, I noticed your energy peak up there. I noticed that you started talking quicker. And so that's the kind of noticing I'm going to do. And I'm going to always be careful to introduce words and just having sort of a general knowledge of what these words might be, that walk the line of diagnosis. So as a coach, I would never want to, I would ask about their energy shift and their energy, noticing their energy going up and them getting excited. But I would never say, I noticed you getting a little manic there.
Bring a little bit of a manic energy to this.
Felt a little you're talking really fast. You were all over the place. That felt a little manic. As a coach, I would caution against introducing words like that. And so you want to know what those words are. Like you're going to want to take the time to sit down and know what those words are, and how they might have a larger implication when you're using them, because they're common. They can be so easily thrown around in our day-to-day vernacular, right?
What about when the client switches it and they're saying, coming to the session, I'm feeling a bit manic today.
Is
I'm
that
a little OCD?
Okay. Is that like clinical?
No.
Clinical mania or clinical
No, I'm
OCD?
just, I've just been
like
I'm just feeling, like
Yeah.
And
I
that's
want
fine.
everything in order,
I would-
and I've got a lot of high
Then that's
energy.
fine.
That's fine. They've introduced it, and I'm going to ask, well, what does mania feel like to you? What does being manic feel like to you? What does
Right.
being OCD feel like for you? What does this
Yeah.
mean? Like, and I would get curious about defining what that means. And they might say to me, well, I have an official diagnosis, and it's just my symptoms are really acting up. Or they might say, I feel really all over the place and scatterbrained and all of these other
Right.
things. So,
I think I'm of the opinion as a coach, like I would probably ask them not to use those words for the sake of clarity and maybe my own personal comfort. I would
You
be
would
okay.
police their language?
I probably would in this situation. I mean, not me personally. I would probably just go along with it, but I wouldn't think worse of a coach for saying, hey, because think about it this way: what if this coach has somebody who in their life is manic or has OCD or autism or
That's
just
not.
I have
mean,
to be able to set that aside. That's
Yeah.
about me, not making it about the client.
I don't know.
Yeah.
That means you got to do some more work.
You got to get coached on that.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. I think it is approaching the boundary of like etiquette where a coach can say, "Hey, like this word is used in a different context in my life. For the sake of clarity, can we not use manic to
I would
describe
never-
that
I
behavior?"
would not work with
Million years.
anyone who said that to me.
I think you just failed at ICF right now.
You have
I
not
mean,
provided
I'm-
a safe space for me.
I'm
Anthony.
using very tame examples. Like I kind of want to introduce maybe more controversial language into this topic on the live, but like
But you're making a judgment. You're making a judgment. If you were truly doing this, you would be
Mhm.
making a judgment with me, and it does not feel like I have a safe space to share with you what my thoughts are and feelings are.
okay, so let me push the bounds a little bit to what I'm saying. What about slurs, for example?
Okay.
Like if I had a client who was using slurs in their language, and I'm a coach
That's a
who
good question.
might be negatively affected by those slurs. It's
Yeah,
kind of a different, subject we're talking about, slurs
Yeah.
versus buzzwords.
that would be
but, like,
hard.
what line are we drawing?
I
as
think
coaches?
though but the difference being, can we talk about the difference being like
Yeah.
one is like common courtesy, like common, like that's where on one level the word manic has never been while it might truly like cause damage, and that's sort of what this topic is about, is that it might do more harm than we realize it does when we use these words, but they are definitely less offensive than a slur that
Yeah.
we all know. Anybody out there is not
but
just living under a rock knows not to just introduce
Right.
in any given space.
But the
period.
client might not have the same viewpoint you do. They might be using the slur as common parlance.
And
in
at
their
that point, I might say we're not great fit for each other.
We're not a good fit. We
Yeah.
have to be able to be in the space together and both
gotta go
feel okay.
I
It's
know a
required.
racist coach down the street I can refer you to. Like, she's not gonna fly with me.
Oh gosh.
Well, that's
Yeah.
what, and Sue, you're bringing up, if slurs were involved and it could get in the way of coaching, then that needs to be discussed to see if the coach is the best fit.
Yeah.
I'm trying to apply that same level of thinking to these buzzwords when it comes to mental health, because that could get in the way of coaching, especially if you yourself have or know somebody who
So
might be
that's what-
OCD
and yeah.
or manic or whatever.
So we're passing judgment right there when we say, okay, we couldn't do that. And maybe there is a coach that just, it's too much. That's their boundary. They've got to set that boundary ahead of time, and then it'll be between the two of them to decide how to proceed. Honestly, like that coach will have to communicate this is not a space they can hold, and then that client can choose to stay or go at that point. And I think that our judgment is we're very capable of holding that space, but maybe there is a coach that isn't very capable. So we can't, I can respect that for that coach that couldn't handle that.
Sure.
The only place I think that's a very like generic term. The only time I think that I would really like, outside of that being like a personal preference kind of thing, it becoming worrisome would be like liability wise. Like oh, well, he coached me on my mania the whole time. Did you use the word mania? Yeah, I use the word mania all the time. And he kept coaching in that space, etc. Where that's the only time I might be a little concerned about it, is if you don't ask into that definition, defining what it is, and figuring out, if this referral out and everything, and just sort of really getting curious in that space and figuring out what it is you're talking about. But we have again gone down the
hold on. I have a thought about that. If it's in your coaching agreement that this is not a substitute for mental health care, it's
And it should be, by the way.
Right. Your agreement is explicit about that, which if you come through our program, you get that. You get a sample coaching agreement that is very clear about the distinction between coaching and therapy and mental health. Can't someone be coached on anything?
So the argument being that if they are suffering from, there's going to be, it gets very gray.
But maybe they're receiving both.
Yeah, if they're receiving, so there's a big difference if they're receiving both. I'm talking about a moment if a client, and I think there have been cases, I will have to look it up, brought up in this space where the client felt as though the coach was mistreating them. Essentially, they were not. The coach was in the things I've read. The coach was clearly not coaching, right? But they are offering coaching, but they're not working in a coaching container. Truly, there's things that they're doing wrong. But that client then afterwards brings it to a court of law, saying that this coach basically overstepped their bounds. They did X, Y, and Z. They were treating my illness, they weren't treating my illness, and they shouldn't have been. And all of these things happen. And that's this not a good place for anybody to be in. Doesn't look good for anything, right?
What you're referring to, Brooke, in that
clause is not going to get you out of that at that point, especially if the client has a mental health disorder that renders them sort of fully capable of understanding what it is they're agreeing to, and you're coaching outside of the coaching container, but doing something other than the coaching. Yes, Anthony?
What you were referring to was, I think it was one of a case study of a psychologist who offered coaching services, and I think the reason why, so that they could coach people outside of the state that they're licensed. And in those coaching sessions, they were not doing coaching; they were doing psychology, and that's what got them in trouble. Yeah. But to answer your question,
they don't have a license.
What happens in a coaching session and what is written on a piece of paper as a contract can be two different things. And you as a coach could still get in trouble for,
you have to be
violating your own agreement.
So
that's because you say you're not practicing therapy doesn't mean what's happening in the coaching session is kind of your attempt at therapy, and then it goes south from there.
We have made it to the end of the live, and it just turned into a very legal feeling live.
That was an interesting discussion. We went all over the place there.
I did go all over the place, but yes, we have made it.
We didn't even get to go into how these buzzwords are used in marketing.
That was a controversial live.
It was a controversial live.
Everybody disagreed with Anthony yet again.
The whole month is going to be controversial coaching. So come back for more controversial discussion where we will all be at odds with one another. And asking tough questions in this coaching space. We'll be back next week at 4 p.m. Quick, if anybody has final thoughts really quick, now is the time.
Buzzwords, use them or lose them.
Be mindful. That's what I've got.
Yes, be mindful and be educated. That's as best you can, of course. Yeah. We'll be back next week at 4 p.m. with more controversial coaching topics. Excited. I'm not going to tell you what, because we haven't decided what we're doing next week. There's some controversy behind the scenes about what we want to do, and arguments are happening where you can't even see things. So,
people are getting triggered.
All kinds. It's just madness. It's just an emotional whirlwind of opinions happening behind the scenes here at CLCI. Make sure you check out our classes. We certify life coaches in 3 days.
Acme. We didn't talk about Acme.
Oh, to those of you who are alumni, make sure you sign up for Acme. And if you aren't alumni, sign up for class so you can sign up for Acme. That's really
Yes.
a two-part process there. And we have extended our early bird sale for $99 on Acme. Also, we're having a spring sale right now, and it's worth mentioning. For those of you listening after May 2024, this is irrelevant. For those of you listening in the month of May 2024, we have $200 off of all of our classes, all of our weekend classes, and all of our packages right now.
Well,
So,
weekend coaching 101 classes.
weekend coaching. Wow, I just got a speech. Weekend coaching 101 classes, very specific. Weekend coaching 101 classes, and our
Package deal.
our education package. So come on down, check us out, get that $200 off, and then sign up for Acme after that. That's all for me, guys.
Okay. See you guys next week.